So shalom bim Rabbi Yasser shalom bim Rabbi Yisrael bim Rabbi say Bisa Darbi Salavi Salosh mit dem Shabbat Elam min kol b'chasa b'shirasa b'chas v'nechamasa damiram b'amavim Rabbi. In the name of God, Jacob fortify you. May He and your help from the may He send your help from the sanctuary and support you from Zion. May He remember all your offerings and always accept favorably your sacrifices. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. It's really nice to see life beginning to open up here in New York City, capital of the world. We want to see values-based discussions. We want to see culture. We want to see religion. We want to see political discourse all reopen in this most influential of cities. We had a live event a month ago with the 70th Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo. It was right outside, where we inaugurated a brand new Torah written in my father's memory. That was a great honor. That was outdoors. This is our first indoors event. Thank God people are getting vaccinated. They've just announced that Broadway is going to be reopening at full capacity in September. Our close friend Sir Clive Gillinson told me just yesterday that Carnegie Hall is reopening. He's head of Carnegie Hall. So I'm happy that we can participate in that by having a values-based conversation with two very eminent luminaries. Let me first begin by the Jewish tradition. On a yortzeit, this is the first memorial for my father. On a yortzeit, we toast and say a l'chaim, affirmation of life, to the person who's been lost. So this is the first yortzeit for my father, Yoav ben Eshrat. His name was Yoav. My father was born in Iran, in the city of Esfahan, which is the ancient imperial capital of Iran. Well, no one would have expected my father to come to Los Angeles, build a family, have a son who's a rabbi. I've tried this entire year to do things in my father's memory. We wrote a Torah in my father's memory. We had this special event with Secretary of State Pompeo. And I'm so grateful to the Secretary of State for coming all the way to show my father that great honor. And I dedicated a book in my father's memory, which is not being released for 2 weeks. But today I got back from a trip, and I got to see the very first copy. In summer of 2017, I took a trip with my family to the leading Holocaust sites all over Europe, but especially in Poland. And this is the book that has resulted, and it's dedicated to my father, to the memory of Sheldon Adelson, who passed away 3 months ago, who was very involved with our work, and to my wife's great uncle, who was murdered in Auschwitz in 1944. And we saw his name in the martyrs' roll. So I just want to read what I wrote about my father. I wrote, to my father, Yoav Boteach, who passed away while I was completing the manuscript of this book at 87 years old. That was 1 year ago tonight. I am in the midst of the 11-month recital of the Kaddish Mourner's Prayer, 3 times a day for my father, a haunting and beautiful Jewish ritual that was denied the 6 million of the Holocaust. And then to my wife's great uncle, and to Zolly Wiesner, my wife Debbie's great uncle, who was murdered at Auschwitz at just 22 years old. May his memory be an eternal blessing. One of the reasons that I asked these two great luminaries to join us tonight, Dr. Mehmet Oz and Bret Stephens in the New York Times, is not only because they're such good friends and they carry such global influence. It's also because they lost parents over the past few years. I remember when Bret lost his father. That was in 2011. You were very close to your father. And as I said in the kitchen at our reception, the column you wrote about your father, when everyone was discussing the Me Too movement and the way he trained you to respect women, it was a very brave, it was an audacious column, and you spoke about the values that he imparted to you, and I was very moved by that, and I called you the same day. I read Bret religiously, no pun intended. I think people do all over the world, but that was a very memorable column. And I knew Dr. Oz's father, Mustafa, in the same way that Dr. Oz is the best-known doctor in the entire United States and the world. His father was the best-known doctor in all of Turkey. And I got to visit his father in his home in Istanbul, and I got to be on 1 day's vacation with his father and his family in Turkey. Your the great physician. He was a great physician. I'm sure that influenced you as well. And we talked a lot about Father's Mehmet. So let me first begin by thanking such a distinguished panel to be with us tonight at a live event, which is so rare. Dr. Oz, you are a blessing to America. You are an American and Turkish light into the nations. I love that you embrace your heritage. We Jews live by our roots. We all respect you. We all love you. We all look up to you. I can personally attest, and I want to say this on the record, as many people are watching this and we're also recording this, I want everyone to know what a gentleman you are. What a superlative husband and father and friend you always are. When people see the posts by Daphne that you get 30, 40, 50, 100,000 views every time, that relationship that you have with her and your grandchildren is real. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's quite remarkable. So thank you for everything that you are, and we're all very grateful you're here tonight. Thank you very much. And what can I say? Bret always tells me that I overdo praise for him, but everything that I say about Bret, I really feel. Bret is a mentor to me. He's a guiding light. I seek out his counsel on moral issues. I always have. When I've had great moral conundrums in my life, and politically and so many other things, he's been the #1 public figure that I've called, because Bret is a great values-based exponent to the entire world.
That's
not really true. Not really true. I think Bret knows how much I love him and how much I respect him, and how fortuitous that we could be here tonight before your mother's having major surgery, overseen by Dr. Oz and Columbia Presbyterian. We also have Donna Tabas, whose husband Ira is a leading physician at Columbia Presbyterian. Dr. Ira Tabas, thank you for being here tonight, Donna. And we prayed for your mother's well-being as we did last night, and we know it's going to be under Dr. Oz. I was with Dr. Oz when he did surgery. I was wearing scrubs. It was quite remarkable to see how you save lives, so I know that she's going to be fine. God willing, we all pray for her well-being and her welfare. I'm so happy that we said Psalms in it for her. I want to finally, before we begin, welcome the Polish Consul General to New York with his wife, such dear friends who joined us for Shabbat dinner, and I want to thank you, as I do in this book repeatedly, for the Polish government's incredible friendship with the Jewish people and the preservation of all the Holocaust sites. And they're standing up for Israel when it really needs it, especially tonight when Israel's under fire. So thank you for your friendship. And to the Albanian ambassador to the United Nations, Bessiano, thank you for being out here tonight as well. We're so grateful. I want to thank my wife Debbie, who just came with a long trip with me, for the comfort she's provided in an extremely, extremely difficult year. And my children for being here, and all the people who prayed with us over the past 11 months, so I could say Kaddish for my father 3 times a day. Thank you all. So many of them are here tonight. We had to limit the numbers tonight, but it's amazing to see that so many people are still able to come in our first live event since the beginning of this pandemic, and I hope it'll pass from the earth. And, yes, go ahead, Dr. Oz.
Let me ask Bret, what was that when you first heard his father was passing? I don't know the details of it. And I ask in part because I was given advice when I lost my father. Knowing that I get lots of people writing, because he was fairly prominent, bigger than life personality, that I would get lots of messages, and the advice I got was to just collect them, because you won't be able to process them. And 6 months in the future, a year, whenever you're ready, you go back and start going through them, the ones you saved, and actually understand what people are trying to tell you. Because people can be very intimate when you've lost a loved one, especially a parent, because many have gone through it already.
When my father passed away of a glioblastoma almost exactly 10 years ago, and as you well know, the prognosis is pretty much very clear and almost predictable in terms of the duration. So I've been thinking about him for a long time. It came in 2 ways. To your immediate question, a lot of incredibly important that they were able to see him before, while he was, relatively speaking, capable of speaking. But then there was a second category of people who hadn't known him, and I wanted to do my father, who was not a famous man, some homage by writing a column. You referenced a column I wrote about him in connection to the Me Too movement, which was a separate thing, but I wrote a column immediately after his death, or within a couple weeks after his death.
In the journal?
In the journal, the Wall Street Journal. And I think if I had to sort of choose one column to be my epitaph, that would be it. And I wrote about the manner of his dying, or rather the dignity with which he entered what he knew was going to be an end, because his father had also died of a glioblastoma and his sister had died of a glioblastoma. So this is something that runs in our family. I've never received more mail from strangers than for that column. And I collected it in 3 binders that are roughly this tall. And it was an immense comfort, not simply because so many people wrote, but because so many people were comforted by the column, because they had loved ones who were dying. Many of them had brain cancer. A great many neurologists kept writing me and telling me I needed to get tested. That was a separate thing.
Oh, gosh.
Which is something I kind of didn't want to do, because it's a terminal illness. Why would I want to?
What a buzzkill.
Yeah, what a buzzkill. But I thought it was very important to give him some honor, public honor, which he had never really had in his life, and allow people to get to know the man who shaped me even after he was gone. Now, obviously, that's not something everyone has an opportunity to do, but it helped manage my grief.
Because you felt you were able to do something for people to know who he was?
It helped me, I don't know.
You were leveraging some of the things that you had achieved in this life and superimposing it on his memory so people could know him.
Yeah, well, that's right. And what the thing I wanted also to do is focus a spotlight on a man who I think was a perfect father, who was unknown to the world, largely unknown to the world. And so frame his life in themes that were more universal. And that at least for me was a tremendously therapeutic exercise, and it really allowed me to get over the first year of his death relatively in one piece. I also threw myself into work that year, which was the other thing that helped me.
And the Jewish obligation to say the mourner's prayer 3 times a day is a major distraction, because it's the hardest thing that you have to do in life. It's easily the hardest religious obligation I've ever had, having to pray 3 times a day with a quorum of 10 for 11 months, not missing one. So is it about distraction, or is it the exact opposite? You're just surrounded by reminders that you lost your parent? Because I will pray with men, and then I'll be the one who stands up and says Kaddish. I immediately self-identify as the mourner in the group. So Bret just said that he threw himself into work, so that's a form of distraction. What's the best way to go about grieving? Is it through distraction, or is it through immersion?
Well, I mean, immersion, no matter how you get there, is probably the most therapeutic, but it also, I think, it's a clarion call to focus on what matters. It's almost trite to say it, but your parents are supposed to die before you. A road tragedy is if the inverse happens. And I feel for all the parents who've lost children, moms especially feel like it's an amputation. But losing a parent is a natural part of life. And if life's working correctly, it should happen. And as harsh as that sounds, it's something that is part of the natural order, which we all have to figure out a meaning to. So, remember when my grandmother passed away, my father's mother. And, you know, these people they lived through a century where the world changed several times. And she was born prior to the Ottoman Empire's collapse. Because her father had died, she was considered an orphan. In Turkey, if your mom's alive, back then it didn't matter. If your father's dead, you're basically an orphan. So the rule was if you married a military officer, the officer was exempted from the army. And my grandfather had been in the army for 15 years. He actually fought in Albania. and in a terrible battle, probably had PTSD from that, from what I can piece together, but they got married, lived their whole life. But when she died, she was the leader of the family. To me, it was like she was just away at an event. She just never came home one day. I didn't really process it. I was a younger adult. I wasn't ready to deal with that level of loss. My father is different, because at my age, when you lose your father, you're also losing the patriarch, so you become the patriarch. You sort of become an orphan in a way, right, in that lineage. And then you have to start picking up all the pieces. And that's a whole separate level of pain. Especially because my mom was, at the time, just beginning to develop Alzheimer's, which my father was compensated for. And she couldn't really process what had happened to him. And so all that becomes a juggling act that you've got to be pretty mature to be able to accomplish. But whether it's work or the Kaddish, or your spirituality, reconnecting, we are the safety net for each other. And we're supposed to be able to go through these moments of grief in community. And I don't know if it happened with you, Bret, but it's, you basically built a community with writing it. You have a natural inborn community building a minion 3 times a day. I don't know how you pull that off. Kudos to you. For me, it was my family, because I ended up having to rally together in ways you probably couldn't have happened for many, many years. But I think that's probably the natural human response. There's a little town in southern Turkey. It's actually very close to where Abraham met Sarah. It's called Grieving, Potbelly Hill. It's the oldest true human temple / civilization in the world. It's about 12,000 years old. That's 3 times older than the pyramids, to give you an idea. And there's something in the drinking water there, because these guys figured out how to pull together gazelles and domesticate them and plant crops. But I bring that up because I always was raised to think that humans were hunter-gatherers, and then we sort of figured out how to cultivate stuff, became farmers. And once we were farmers, then we developed religion, because we had some free time in our hands. It's a very utilitarian view of religion. But what's evident from the archaeological explorations in Göbekli Tepe, much of it done by German archaeologists, is that that's not what happened. Humans were hunter-gatherers, and we still would have been hunter-gatherers if it wasn't for religion. But when they began to do, at the time, was ancestor worship, they would actually celebrate their parents. They built these 17-foot tall tea temples, and once they could talk to something bigger than them, they saw a divine spark that was bigger than them. They then had the audacity to believe they could domesticate wildlife, plant crops, control nature, and then they became agricultural. So this process of what happened to your parents, respecting their memory, and being a good ancestor to the next generations by planting trees or building temples or whatever, is part of our calling. So the ritual of losing a parent has incredible significance, I think, to our species, and how we process it in our different ways is what continues our sovereignty.
Yeah, I was thinking about something you said earlier, and I remember reading somewhere, I'm not sure where, that this at least applies to boys, that a son becomes a man when he loses his father, and he becomes an orphan when he loses his mother, which I've been thinking about. But to the question about distraction or immersion, I did everything I could in the first year to distract myself, and I threw myself into work. And it turned out to be a very successful year, because then I won a Pulitzer. And I remember the first thing that happened when I was told I won a Pulitzer is I burst into tears with the thought that my father would have burst with pride in that. Actually, I called my mother. When I called my mother, she said, "Oh, that's nice, sweetie. Now she said, now the stupid people will know you're smart." That's just her. That's just her. They just met. So, but my dad would have loved it, and that actually was a turning point for me. In part because I felt, having thrown myself into work, I'd accomplished something, and then I began to spend more time kind of immersively. And it turned out, at least, and all of these cases are so personal. I mean, what's my grief to someone else's? They're sometimes disconnected. I mean, everyone's experience is quite individual. But since that time, I have preserved and cultivated and nurtured my memories of my father on an almost daily basis. So that my father has gone from being an absence in my life to being, in some ways, more of a presence. At least present in the conversations that I carry on in my mind, and present as a model for what I think I should do as a father. And I said this earlier, I think my dad was the best dad, a boy, especially a very awkward, Aspergery maybe, intellectually precocious, emotionally complex child could ask for. He was patient and thoughtful and constantly kind and never lost his patience with me. And that thought has done more to inform the way I am with my children than anything else. And so there is this dad located somewhere up here who is a voice in my head all the time. I mean, it's kind of stuns me. It's like this companion in my mind.
Why are you able to access him better now than when you first lost him or 5 years before? Because your oldest daughter is 17,
Yeah.
your daughter?
Yeah,
So he was alive, obviously, until she was 7.
yeah.
So why were you not processing his wisdom then? What increased his ability to connect to your...
Well, I think that familiarity and the mundane nature of your dad being alive and with you, I think very naturally leads you to not think deeply about the nature of his life and what he means to you, right? I mean, people you know every day are people you don't necessarily appreciate as much as you ought because they're there, right? I mean, that's the nature of life. It is, you know, it's a cliche that absence makes the heart grow fonder, but it maybe makes your mind grow sharper as well. I was having this conversation with a friend of mine who's in the process of writing a long story about someone she knew who was lost on 9/11. A very promising young man who was in one of the towers and died at 26. And in her case, as she's describing the memory of the family, the picture of their brother and son is becoming sort of sepia toned and almost outside of their real life. They don't remember him that well. I've worked hard to maintain what, you know, I'm misusing the term, but a kind of a memory palace of my father.
Did that happen to you at all? Was your dad's presence... I mean, your dad was 87.
He was 87.
You had plenty of time for him to move from mundane to sacred, and it wasn't a surprise when you lost him.
And yet, it was so sad. You make basic preparations for death. You write a will. You make sure, God willing, there was no fighting among your children, that everyone feels that they were treated equally, whatever it is. But then you live as if you're going to live forever. Look at the things you're achieving. Is this great world personality. You're supposed to speak. It's going to come to an end soon. I'm going to start getting, my faculty's going to deteriorate. One of the things that I actually, by the way, liked very much about President Biden and former President Trump was that in their 70s, these guys, like Trump's going to run at 78 years old and Biden's 78. He's running. I like that. When my father died, I started thinking, oh my God, I'm going to die. I'm not going to live forever. My father, who I thought would live forever, he actually died. I couldn't believe it. I sat in this chair a year ago tonight, this exact chair, when my sister called me with a doctor, and the doctor did not say what had happened. He said, your father was rushed in an ambulance, it was COVID-19, and he couldn't breathe. Anyway, they took him, and the doctor told us, and I sat in this chair, it was 12:03 p.m., and I heard that he died. And then my kids started coming. I'll never forget that. I thought way too much about death. I used to feel I was invincible. I used to feel that, and I think my Judaism kind of taught me to believe that life was eternal. And maybe that's a healthier way to live. Why is it healthy to prepare so much?
I don't think it's about preparing for death, but part of the reason I love the game of football is there's a clock that's ticking. Right? And it's eventually, no matter what you do, unlike baseball, for example, the game will end when the clock ticks 0. And I don't think we're well served to focus on death, but we're definitely poorly served to not realize that the clock will have 000 on it one day. And to waste the opportunities that are offered to you, not seize the opportunity, the day, because you think, just do it tomorrow, which is one of the greatest failings of men. What makes humans, I think, different in many ways is we have a sense of time. That was one of the fundamental structural shifts, the belief that there's a time that's moving, and we have to play in that time continuum. I'm not talking about New Age physics, I'm just talking about the little belief that the clock is ticking and one day it won't. Something we all could cope with. The losing our father does make us a man, not because we weren't a man, not because you weren't a man before, but because you now need to be the man of the family for everybody else. You need to be there to do the things your father did that no one noticed. All the subtle, in my case, covering my mom, like finishing her sentences, doing subtle stuff that I was unaware of. And you don't know that, you don't know what you don't know. None of us do. Your dad was doing things probably even at 87, you had no idea. He was, filling in the gaps that you weren't aware of. Your dad, I'm sure, did that, but in a very visible way, but in ways that weren't so obvious as well.
Can I ask you a question, Shmuley? I mean, you had a contentious, not always easy relationship with your dad, right?
Yeah.
And I've always wondered how, for me, processing grief was made a lot easier by the fact that there was a lot of lot to look back on that was just wonderful and marvelous about him.
And I was raised by my mother, single mother. And I just acknowledge that on Mother's Day. I always acknowledge what my mother did for me, raising us, 2 jobs, teller at a bank during the day, checkout clerk at a supermarket at night, just to put us through Jewish day school. What I most feared when my father started getting sick is I feared that I would be crushed. I told Debbie many times, I'm terrified that I will be crushed by regret over not having a better relationship. And I'd like to fix it as much. I came and saw Mehmet about this. I drove to your house in New Jersey and we sat and you gave me very good advice. I don't know if you remember that. It was an afternoon. I wanted, my father's health wasn't great and things were deteriorating and I wanted to make things better. Maybe that's the genius. You know, I wrote Kosher Sex 20 years ago and the idea was to show that Judaism is very smart about sexuality, romance, erotic attraction. And people say it's even smarter about grief. Maybe one of the genius things about Judaism is that when you have to say Kaddish 3 times a day, and I had to organize most of my own quorums of 10 because of COVID-19, and thank God I didn't miss one, I did all that after he died, so it mitigated the possibility of regret because I was doing so much for him. I was writing a Torah in his name. I had written a book in his memory. Most of all, I was saying Kaddish. The regret that I feared would crush me, that I was terrified, never came. Now that Kaddish is over, I'm afraid. Debbie and I were just in Hawaii. We should have had a great time, and we did. It was so nice to be husband and wife again, and not just parents and not just community members organizing these prayer services. But I said to Debbie many times over the past few weeks in Hawaii that memories of my father are just like really saddening.
So you mentioned kosher sex. My wife Lisa, who likes to have these long, drawn-out biblical battles with Shmuley, thinks your next book should be on grief. Because I've been invited to my share of sitting Shiva with Jewish friends, and I'm just not sure what the grief literature is in Judaism. I know it is in Christianity. They spend a fair amount of time talking about death, in part because I think Christ died, so that's sort of fundamental to Easter. And how in Judaism is that managed? What is the wisdom around complex relationships? Because Bret asked the right question. The biggest problems I have with patients who are passing is when the family all gets together and you realize it wasn't so happy. And all of a sudden, all those emotions percolate to the top. People hate each other because of the person who's dying. And then they can't make any decisions about the person who's dying. And you're just trying to sort of wiggle your way through the room, avoiding the landmines that clearly were lit sometimes decades earlier. But I'm sure complex father-son relationships are not new. In fact, I got to admit this is I don't talk about this too much, but I really think that there's sometimes a benefit to having a complicated relationship with your father. It forces you to deal with stuff that might actually make you more resilient when you're an adult. It's sort of shocking how many successful men are pretty clear that dad wasn't a major player for them.
And almost every American president, right?
Oh yeah, I think of that example specifically. I don't want to get into politics, but it's not just in presidents. It's in a lot of corporate leaders, religious leaders. Because your dad wasn't around. You did turn out pretty well. I mean, how essential was dad? He actually was critical. The fact that he wasn't there was important.
You know, my friend Sally Richardson is here, and she's one of America's most distinguished publishers. She publishes Macmillan, St. Martin's Press, and she's published a few of my books. It's very bad that Mehmet brings up this book, which he doesn't even realize I've already written. I've written a book about grief.
Oh, good.
I don't have a publisher. Poor Sally.
I shouldn't be laughing.
Yeah, poor Sally.
I should be smiling.
Sally is America's most distinguished female publisher. It's always an honor to have you, and thank you for being here. I wanted to write that book because I was trying to process everything that I felt. It was so interesting for my children to watch me over the past year, because I think my kids always felt they kind of got me, essentially the kind of person I was, complicated and volatile at times, but a loving father for all my imperfections and failures, but a loving father like you. You're a very loving father. I'm very involved in my kids' life. They might say too involved. But then they suddenly...
clingy. They say you're clingy.
Yeah, they do believe that. I'm too protective. But then they suddenly saw a whole other side of me as I was, trying to process everything that I was feeling over the past year and doing all this. And maybe they were even surprised by the degree of immersion into my father's memory. Because I became obsessed with making sure, like Bret said he wanted his father known. My father wasn't well known, I wanted him known. Look, I mean, your father, as I said, was the best known doctor in all of Turkey. You're the best known doctor in the entire world. I don't know what complication that may have led to. I don't know. That's like a, wow. I mean, was your father very proud of the fact? The time I met your father for the first time, we took you to Israel, you were the most famous doctor on planet Earth, period. And by the time we did a press conference at the grave of Maimonides, Tiberius with you, all the Israeli press came, because it was the greatest Jewish doctor of all time, Maimonides, is being visited by and he was Jewish. He was the Jewish doctor to the greatest Muslim leader of all time, Sultan Saladin the Great. And now we had the world's most famous doctor who's Muslim now visiting in Israel at the grave of Maimonides. And then a week later we were with your father, Büyük Baba, Big Daddy in Turkish. I loved meeting him. But there must have been, that's interesting. Did your father acknowledge what you had become in terms of, that that's a stature that's unbelievable?
It's complicated because he didn't really understand the game I was playing. As he was an immigrant to this country, didn't understand college structures, getting in. Sports to him was a foreign concept. Why I bothered playing sports in high school and college when I should have been studying. Going into television media was really a shock to him. He thought that was just an abrupt U-turn in my life. I should just be in the operating room taking care of patients. I could never convince him that I'm in the change business. And if I can't get people to change, and the only thing I can do is open their chest with a bandsaw, because they didn't take certain steps that I really thought could have been supportive, preventive, life-changing before I healed with steel, that I was wasting my time. She never processed that. And I don't think he needed to. That's one of the things I learned early in my life. Lisa's always stunned because she says, you don't look for approval. I never got anything. So I stopped looking after a while. And it wasn't that he didn't want to give it. He never got it. He grew up in the Depression in Konya, which is like being in Nashville. It's like where the Rolling Dervishes are. So he's in the Quran belt, like the Bible belt, and literally sleeping on dirt floors. He didn't get up in the morning and wonder who was going to applaud him. So it made him much less desirous, or not even desirous, capable of processing what was going on later in his life. But it didn't matter because I wasn't looking for that.
You really weren't. Don't all of us sons look for our fathers?
Of course we do, but it gets you beat it down because you didn't get it. That's why Bret's story is so interesting to me.
You did get it, right?
Oh, in spades.
Your father knew what you had.
It's my mother who is the deflator.
That's it. That's the right word. There's a deflator in our lives. There has to be. Or else you don't learn to blow the balloon back up again.
No, I mean, she had a heart attack on Friday, and we were in the hospital on Saturday playing chess, and we're even. I'm playing against an infirm, wiped the floor with me in one game.
Is she trash talking you?
She always does, essentially, and this is. She's obviously, a great force in my life. We're talking about fathers here, but my mother is.
Who is a bigger force, your father or your mother?
It's very hard to say.
The deflator or the praiser?
That's a great question. They perform a yin and yang function, but my mother. I made a point of writing a couple of columns about my father after he died, and I reflected on that and decided that I was going to write the columns praising my mother before she died, so she could read them, and some homage could go her way. But in every case,
You writing something this week?
no, not this week. I hope not.
No. Don't jinx it.
I don't want to jinx anything. But I did during when the pandemic began, when she was mocking my views of, the line from her is, I don't remember your degree being in epidemiology, something like that.
That's great.
No, she's great. I mean, look, everyone needs to get the air taken out of them, and she's very effective at it.
So let me ask you that. I was told when I was a young man.
She's a very loving mother.
That's
by the
it.
way. But there's no getting too big.
But that's
for your
actually the
britches,
question that I was going towards. From what I was taught, I remember this was being stunned by this data. I don't know how you prove this, but I was told that the most important predictor of how successful someone is, or at least how happy they are, is how much they think they were loved as a child.
Really?
Not how much they were actually loved, how much they think they were loved. Which includes, theoretically, your parents telling you you're loved, sensing that there's moments when you're truly loved despite what you've done right or wrong. That's interesting. That doesn't always translate to whether you were really loved or not. I suspect that's
Yeah.
part of the success. One way or the other, whether deflating or inflating you, there was love involved in that process.
Yeah, and there's no question, and there was a tension involved in the process. That's what I'm trying to be mindful of with respect to my own children. My father paid attention to me, and it's very easy when you're a busy parent just simply not to do it because your kids are there and think there's something more pressing, that you have to do, and. In fact, with my youngest child, we go for long walks now that we live out in the boonies, and she will say to me, okay, we're going to talk about World War II today. And we'll just talk about World War II for an hour. It's great, and that's exactly how I was raised by my dad. But when she asks me that, I'm mindful that I'm now in the role that my father played towards me, which is why, I know what happened in the Second World War. And in Konya, where I have some wonderful carpets, by the way.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Did you feel like your father, even though he was estranged for a while, loved you?
Yeah, I think it's much more complicated when your parents are divorced. Like my mother, tonight is the first day of the anniversary of my father's passing. My mother's not in mourning. My mother actually got, I think, a little bit upset when my father died a year ago, and I wrote my eulogy, I wrote columns as well, and my mother called me and said, you're aggrandizing your father beyond what he was in life, kind of what Ted Kennedy said about Robert Kennedy in that famous eulogy, where my brother need not be aggrandized in life more than he was in death. But that's how I felt, and I wanted my father, like what Bret said about a father being known, it really resonated with me. But when your other parent isn't on board, it's very complicated. Like when your mother almost feels like, wait a second, this was not a happy marriage, and the way you're telling the story is not the way it was, but it's how I saw things at that time. My father loved me. He wasn't proud. It's strange. It's hard for me. I don't know if Debbie might disagree with me. There were times when he showed great pride, but in general, my becoming a rabbi was not something that he was on board with. He was a businessman. He was from Iran. They were merchants. They were business people. The rabbis were the teachers who were supported by the community. He wanted me to be one of the people doing the supporting and not being supported. There was dignity in being a businessman. There wasn't dignity in being, and yet, when I would later become, my father loved Israel, and obviously growing up as a Jew in Iran was complex, and so a lot of things that I did which were unexpected for him, he would show pride, but there would be little glimpses. It's funny because I never really talk about this because I never want anything that I say to ever, God forbid, reflect anything but positively on my father, who I miss very much and who I love very much. But yeah, it was definitely a complex relationship. I remember once, Debbie and I were sitting with the Empress of Iran, Empress Farah Diba, at her home in Maryland, and my father grew up. She was his queen. So now I'm sitting, and I said, do you mind if we call my father? And we call my father up, and she starts speaking to my father in Persian. And my father couldn't believe this, that the Empress of Iran is calling him because of his son, the rabbi, who does stuff with Israel. And he was in awe.
When were you maddest at your father?
When I felt that he just didn't get it. That taking this business thing further, that my father had an immigrant mentality. He had to succeed as an immigrant. He had to be a successful businessman. When I kind of know that I kind of know that my success is going to come down to whether my kids think well of me, that I was the loving. If one day my children speak of me the way Bret is speaking of his father tonight, I'll know that I have succeeded. And I think my kids kind of know that for all my shortcomings. My son Mendy is here.
You have no shortcomings.
From your mouth to God's ears, very true. Like I often think about my relationship with Mendy. My eldest son, and him having to grow up with me as a father, and with am I doing what Bret did? Am I processing everything that happened between me and my father to make sure that everything me and my eldest son and all my other children is? And Mendy is my partner in so many of the things that I do, including tonight. And he's the most incredible son. I call him Golden Son. He's my golden son. But I often think about. It bothers me my father didn't fully get that. But I don't feel I have the right to judge him, because I'm not an immigrant to this country. I didn't have that chip on my shoulder. I didn't have to kind of prove myself. Remember, my father married an Ashkenazi woman from New York, from Brooklyn, very white. My father was a dark-skinned Jew from Iran. My father told me when he first came to New York, even other Jews here in New York referred to him as Schwarz, that he was a black Jew. And he faced all this kind of discrimination, let alone he couldn't speak English. Throughout his life, he could barely speak English. But he ran a successful business, and that was very important to him. To the extent, I wouldn't say anger, but to the extent that I feel that he missed the message, it was that if you don't succeed with your family, you've blown it. I remember watching you, we were in Israel, and you have to understand, when Mehmet was in Israel a few years back, it was a big deal. The press followed him all around the country. The Israelis were really proud that he came. And the Prime Minister of Israel met him, Netanyahu, and showed him, oh my gosh, we thought he'd get like a photo op. It was like a 2-hour meeting. And they discussed policy and all kinds of interesting things. I remember watching you when, like, a bunch of your, we got you 3 or 4 rooms in the hotel in Yerushalayim, and you came in and you said, no, you have to stay here. You wanted to make sure the kids were doing things the right way, and we're packing their stuff, and I couldn't believe it. You were pretty busy on that trip, and I saw, well, this guy gets it, and I've always seen you with your children. I think we kind of have to get it. I see Bret with his children as well. We were at, Bret's daughter Laura's bas mitzvah and helped prepare her for the bas mitzvah. And, I think we have to remember that if you don't succeed with your kids, if you're not a hero to your children, even if you're a hero to the whole world, you failed. And I wanted my father to kind of get that. But like I said, who am I to judge? I didn't have the kind of, my father left school at 10, 12 brothers and sisters, 13 children. They were dirt poor. He had to support them. So whenever and even if my kids ever judged my father, I would always tell them, like kind of who are we to judge? On the other hand, Debbie was raised by parents who were the exact opposite. Debbie's parents were incredibly loving and never, just like, it was not a complicated relationship. If I had to choose, I would not choose a complicated relationship. I have so much to prove. Bret loves me, but he knows I have so much to prove. And he always comments in public events that I have so much to prove. And that's what comes to an extent from deprivation, as it were, from attention deficit, etc. And I was not raised around my father. I used to cry when I was a boy that my father wasn't, he was in Los Angeles, we were in Miami. And maybe now, I even say to my kids, maybe now, I feel it's really strange that in death, I feel I have more control over my relationship with my father than even in life. Because now it's only a one-way relationship. Before it was 2 ways. I would give love, I'd have to get back love, he'd give love. It had to be reciprocal. Now it's just one way. Everything I do for my father, it's just one way.
But this, I was on a radio interview with Hugh Hewitt about a week ago or so, and somehow in passing he said something like, my parents went on to their reward 20 years ago or something like that. And I was struck by that phrase, went on to their reward. To me, I said, what reward is that? Exactly. I mean, obviously I understood what he's saying. He's Christian, and there's an idea of a reward. Well, that's not quite so operative here in our faith tradition. So, what is the reward? The reward is actually not in some heaven, right? The reward exists entirely in the world of memory and the world of remembrance, and that's what I've always thought about in terms of my relationship with Judaism. It's a people, a religion that cultivates memory like almost no other spiritual tradition of which I'm aware. Everything we do is about cultivating a sense of memory, of knowing who our ancestors were, what they did, who they were as men and women, often, by the way, quite flawed. The patriarchs are all, a little bit meshugana in one way or another, right? And we cultivate, we obsess about this memory. And that, in a sense, is a kind of a template about my relationship with a father who has passed. My mother's a child of the war, and recently she lost, not recently, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the last cousin from her generation born between 1930 and maybe 1940. She was the youngest one in that. And she said, there's no one around anymore who remembers. There's no one I can talk to who has a memory of Italy during the war, the bombs, being in hiding in a garret apartment, as it happens. They're all gone. And my mother thinks about this, that she alone now sort of holds on to these memories. And one of the things that I have done actually quite deliberately over the last few years is talk to her about those memories and sometimes jot them down, because I want to do the best that I can to have a download of what it was. In fact, one of the books that I'm thinking of doing is a book that tells the story of my children's great-grandparents. I'm married to a German. My wife is German. She's a convert. One of her grandfathers was killed in Buchenwald after winning an Iron Cross in the First World War. He was taken as a political prisoner after the firebombing of Hamburg, sent to Buchenwald. Another grandfather, whom even her mother had never met, was a German soldier who died in 43 or 44, just vanished. And then on my father's side, we also have this kind of strange cast of great grandparents. My grandmother, this kind of very flamboyant artist who painted with Diego Rivera and all these people. My grandfather. Anyway, it's a long story, but the point is there's this panorama of personalities who inhabited the world. You were talking about the world of Turkey in the Second World War, who inhabited the world from around 1890 to around 1950, this extraordinary period of time. And my great fear is that the lives they led that were transformed by these titanic historical forces, all of that runs the risk of being completely washed away like a sandcastle built too close to the water's edge. And one of the things I am intent on doing is making sure that doesn't go away. So if you visit my home in Westchester, it's a shrine to where our great-grandparents were circa roughly between 1915, from the Iron Cross, on the German side of the Somme offensive, right? To my grandfather being painted by Diego Rivera and all the rest of this. There are these stunning lives. This, I think, is ultimately the solution to the great fear, because one of the things that I think underlies the potency of grief is the sense that everything will be washed out to sea. And what we try to do when we honor and remember and talk about those we've lost is to keep that sandcastle up, right? To keep those memories vivid enough that they are alive even in the minds of people who never knew them, but are nonetheless in some ways inextricably connected with them.
The reason I mentioned Göbekli Tepe in the beginning was for that, you described it more poetically, but that basic insight. Our species figured out that if we forget the stories that we should take away from our ancestors, the wisdom they gained, good or bad, the trial and error mistakes that we don't want to repeat, all of that becomes fundamental to our actual survival. And so metaphorically, when the castles melt away and they disappear, you see nothing anymore. It's a pretty vapid existence. It's scary. And it's that fear that I think catalyzes some of us to move forward. But not having any relationship with your father and recreating one even towards the end is better than the alternative, which is to erase them like they never existed. And I think celebrating the great-grandparents of your children is a wise move, especially since that era was so formative to the world we're in now.
Right.
And those lessons have been forgotten. I don't think most people today fear the kulak slaughters of Russia and the wheat famine of the 30s. They don't fear, but my father knew all too closely, that the threats of Nazi Germany. Even the Cultural Revolution doesn't seem relevant, really. And those are experiences the world doesn't want to repeat.
I'm seeing the ambassador from Poland, and there's a wonderful passage about Anna Akhmatova, the great Russian poet and writer, during the siege of Leningrad in World War II. And at some point, people knew she was a poet of some renown, and at one of the horrific moments of the siege, someone said to her, "Can you write this? Can you write this?" And this is true, in all the great historical, events. The Katyn Forest Massacre, there's a wonderful line from Milan Kundera that the struggle of man against tyranny is the struggle of remembrance against forgetting.
Yeah.
Which is something I've always loved from him.
Well, that's the reason I wrote this book. I wanted my kids to remember the 6 million, even though it was an excruciating trip. And memories, when you lose a parent, the question also becomes, what do you want to remember? Do you want to remember the whole story, the good and the bad? Do you want to focus specifically on the good? And what do you want to tell your children? Should it be selective memory? And is that a healthier way to live, with selective memory? Or should it be that we learn as much from the failures of our parents as we do from their successes?
The patriarchs, you mentioned it earlier, are much more interesting characters outside of even religion because of their flaws.
Right.
And I think ignoring their shortcomings, first of all, it makes them monodimensional, but the stakes go away.
Right.
I think
That's very important.
you want that. My father's flaws, which were easy to criticize in hindsight, not so easy to criticize if you lived the life he lived, becomes, all the more valuable for me because I could easily excuse away the same. Like most of us, we became like our parents. So my wife reminds me all too readily.
Is that destiny? Is it just gonna happen?
I don't know. In my house, the prosecution never rests. So I get a full dose of this no matter what. But I think, you admire your parents. For anything that may have gone down, if you sense that they loved you, you want to be a bit like them. So I'm certainly much more like my father than I would have acknowledged ever becoming when I was a young man, when I was actively rejecting a lot of those issues. All that said and done, that's not even a value judgment. The reality is it's there. So ignoring it, like ignoring an illness, is not a wise move. Because the abscess will eventually point. And if it doesn't come out through the skin, it'll go deep. And that's a much worse complication.
So there's a great line in Lord Jim, which is a book about grief, by Joseph Conrad, who's now, needs to be ixnayed by the woke crowd, but that's another story. But he says somewhere about Jim, he says, a character in the story who's sort of a proto-psychologist says about Jim, his prescription is, in the destructive element, immerse, the verb at the end. And I think it's a psychologically very, a profound insight into what Jim needs to do to deal with his grief after his disgrace of jumping ship and leaving a ship stranded in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and his sense of dishonor. That there is a value in immersing yourself into the destructive element. I think there's a value in immersing yourself into the more troubling memories. And I say this conscious of the fact that the reason that I became a Joseph Conrad aficionado is because my father loved Conrad and insisted that I needed to read Conrad. So it gives you a sense of the influence that he had on me. My mother is more Tolstoy and Dostoevsky.
Let me put a question to you. The Talmud says something very interesting. It says that a man is jealous of every other man in the world except one, his own son. The Talmud says that men are incapable of being jealous of they want to see their son succeed. But I counsel people, and I'm not sure that's always true. I've seen rivalries between fathers and sons. So your father was the best known physician in his country, and you're the best known physician in the whole world. Did that exist between you and your father at all?
I never sensed jealousy or competition like that. But if I could speak to the father-son dynamic, so my son Oliver, who just got into medical school, is someone, he's never done things the way I would have done them, but he's always done them well in his own way. And I don't feel any competition to him, but I know exactly how my father probably felt towards me. I see things he could do better. I know how I would do them. I tell him he doesn't want to do them my way. And that's probably a natural tug of war. And I don't want to suffocate him by being overbearing. Male and female energy can both be destructive. Ursula, sort of the Little Mermaid, that kind of feminine energy can be really devastating because it's hard for men to push it away. I think it's easier for sons to push their father away because they want to do it their way. And I actually respect that he has that desire. It'd be very easy for him to take my advice because I've charted a path that, for good or for bad, is a pretty effective path. My father certainly charted a path that really worked for him. To go from where he was born to where he ended up was much less probable than what I did. But I didn't want to go his path. And part of it was I just wouldn't have felt I was a real man if I'd done that. So I don't, at least for us it wasn't jealousy. I expect for most people it's not jealousy or competition. It's just a desire to break out. And that's one of the challenges in life now because we don't have a male ritual of manhood. Right? Women sort of still have a biologic ritual when they become a woman. That's, it's going to happen at 13 or 12 or whatever age. Men don't have that moment.
we can delay adulthood. In fact, it does get, I think, in the modern era, delayed much longer than is
Until
healthy.
about 50 or so.
Yeah, whole 50. We have 5 minutes left. If I could, let me ask you about current affairs, because this is something we promised Shmuley we'd bring up, if you're okay with it.
Of course.
Thoughts around what's happening in Israel right now, hopeful insights, concerns?
Look, I was the editor of the Jerusalem Post during the Second Intifada, and I hope very much that we don't have a third Intifada. It will be a survivable event for Israelis because they've been through it before and they're very resilient. It'll be a very destructive event for Palestinians. The Second Intifada was absolutely devastating to the Palestinians. And I say this very mindful, having seen buses blown up on my street. It will put out of reach any hope for some kind of reasonable settlement that allows Palestinians and Israelis to go separate ways peacefully. One thing that concerns me, though, is I hate the framing of this as Arab versus Jew. And I think it's a wrong way of looking at the issue, which is really this is a question of fanaticism versus non-fanaticism. And when Hamas fires 20 or more rockets at Israeli population centers, it's not a kind of it's wrong to think about this. It's a mistake to think about this, especially when we're here in the States, as a kind of an ethnic conflict, because it reduces it to these two characters who can't get out of each other's heads, okay? There is a large population of Palestinians that doesn't want to be ruled by Hamas, doesn't want Hamas using them as body shields for their activity. They don't want to be poster children for the next BDS campaign here in the United States. They don't want to participate in the cynicism of governing Palestinian politics, and we should be on their side too. And that also, so that doesn't mean simply we're taking the side of Israel in the face of this kind of aggression. You should also be able to say we're taking the side of Palestinians when we say that the Palestinian state will never come around through acts of wanton terror and violence and an attempt to blow things up. That's not how it happens. That this is not going to be a strategy that should ever be rewarded, just as we wouldn't want to reward it here in the United States or anywhere else. I hope that that's the approach that, at least rhetorically, I'm thinking through a column already, as you can probably tell.
I'm following you.
That's the way we think about this. We want a good outcome for Palestinians, and a good outcome for Palestinians means, above all, having leaders who don't use them as cannon fodder. The cynicism of Palestinian politics is one of the great underappreciated points of talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
What do the other Arab countries do now? I mean, there's relations with Saudi Arabia now. We've got
right, and this is where I think the Abraham Accords are so important, because I think the leaders in the United Arab Emirates, the Bahrainis, to some extent, I think the Egyptians, see through the just rank cynicism of what Hamas is doing. And don't support it, and shouldn't support it, and shouldn't be goaded into supporting it. On the contrary, they have to send a very different message, which is that we want a Palestinian state. This is not how it's going to be brought about, ever. Period. That Israel is not going to be provoked and bullied into a settlement. So that's my sense of it. That being said, if I had to place a modest bet, I don't see this spasm of violence lasting more than a few days.
Oh, good.
I hope. But, predictions make fools of people in the Middle East. So
why only a few days? What gives you solace or comfort that once the bombs are...
I don't see the end game, and I don't see... The Second Intifada had a certain kind of logic and energy. And among other things, it also had cohesive leadership. at least in the sense that even Arafat, or not even Arafat was every bit as much committed to the Intifada strategy as Hamas was. So despite the internal Palestinian rivalries, they were of one mind about the Intifada strategy, which turned out to fail. Why? Because Israel said they're not going to be bullied into a capitulation, and they're certainly not going to be bullied now. And one of the points is that whoever succeeds Bibi, if he in fact is replaced, is going to be a person of the center right or further right. So the idea that there's going to be a switch in kind of Israeli politics, I think, is probably mistaken. That being said, as I said, predictions make fools of people when it comes to the Middle East. Do you see any sense of a change in Turkish politics? I mean, we've had almost the same set of political leaders for 18 years.
I don't see a change in the near future. Erdogan is very popular domestically.
Yeah.
Much of what he says and does gains him additional support. And people think he's a safe leader. It's very easy sitting in New York City to argue that someone's a strong man that's jailed journalists and not respective of Western rights. But the primary desire, the primary craving of humanity initially is safety. Comfort, to be able to just live your life. And you'll tolerate a lot in order to gain that. And having a strong leader who's avoided some of the failings of prior Turkish leaders. I remember being 19 years of age in Istanbul and being pulled over every block and frisked, searched, threatened, and then allowed to go. And the country was imploding. That was when the coup happened. That
1980.
Yeah, I remember December '79 vividly. The coup happened in '80, but the country was devolving. It was, if you go back and watch movies about the '60s, or rather movies about the Arab world in the '60s, it looks like Paris. So things aren't always that stable, and if you don't have strong leadership, and you're in that part of the world, you realize what that could translate to. Which is why it's interesting to hear you say that if Netanyahu is ousted, it'll be a center right or further right party. If Erdogan were to leave, I don't know if you'd have a liberal group take over. It could be further to the right of him.
Right.
Well, Jefferson thought that what people most wanted was freedom. And now what you're saying is that people seem to want security and stability, and they'll tolerate encroachment on their freedom in order to have that. And that's the whole debate that's going on. But I wanted to, I might just do a couple of questions, but I just want to relate this question about politics to our discussion about death and grieving. The idea that there could be peace in the Middle East is based on this ancient Jewish messianic Isaiah, wolf shall lie with the lamb, men will beat swords into plowshares. And the Abraham Accords were quite remarkable. I can't believe that I was on the White House lawn in September watching this being signed. It was a beautiful sunny day. And here we are back to war. Terrible. But Mehmet, you mentioned Lisa, your wife's a Christian theologian. She's very immersed in the Bible. This belief that there would one day be a utopian life. Now, Bret, as a columnist who's very proud of his rationalism, would look at something like this and say, well, and you're from the University of Chicago, which was all about where real politics was born. And kind of, right? I mean,
Lots of things were born at the University of Chicago.
But the real school of foreign
Atomic
policy.
energy.
Exactly, atomic energy.
But Kissinger, his whole school was very much influenced, right, by the great thinkers of the University of Chicago and Leon Strauss and some people that you look up to. And their whole thing was, forget this utopia stuff, let's go with what's real, with what works. But Judaism says, well, maybe we can aspire a little bit beyond that. Before my father died, I know it sounds odd, but death didn't really encroach in my life. I counseled a lot of people as a rabbi. I conducted a lot of funerals. It was always one step removed. When I saw my father being put into the ground, and this is an amazing story, actually. And by the way, I see my daughter Sterny. Sterny, you got to go? I want to just thank, before I forget, all my kids have been with Sterny and Mendy and Yosef and my son-in-law Moshe and David Chaim. And my kids have been so amazing over the year. All the comfort they've given me. And thank you for coming tonight, Sterny. Sterny's got 2 little kids at home. But a year ago, my father died, and it was the middle of the pandemic, and I go to Israel. And the rabbis told me that Jewish law said I should not go to Israel because I'm risking my life to bury my father. Let my father be buried by people in Israel. I called up Mehmet. I'll never forget this. I wrote several columns about it, and I said to you, should I go? And you said to me, a son has an obligation to put his father into the ground. You said, that's what I did with my father in Istanbul. I put my father into the ground. Infection rates are lower, and New York is safer, and you can go. And I wrote a column afterward. I said, all the world's leading rabbis were telling me I wasn't allowed to go, and the world's most famous non-head of state, most famous doctor was a non-head of, most famous Muslim was not a head of state, told me I had to bury my father, and that's, you were the reason, one of the principal reasons that I went, Debbie and I went, my brothers and sisters went, and I buried my father on the Mount of Olives, which is now where a lot of the fighting is going on, which is tragic. But the point is, this idea of utopia, that things could be better, it's based on a Jewish dream. It's super rational. It transcends rationalism. But it's that idealism that kind of makes us reach for the possibility of people living together in peace, etc. And I feel that my father's death, this thing that you become a man when your father dies, I feel the opposite happened. I feel that cynicism kind of entered my life, that death now encroached on me, that it invaded my space, that it was no longer, I'm not a rabbi who was burying strangers, I was now burying my own father. And at my father's funeral in Jerusalem, I was crying. Mendy was there trying to comfort me. Hannah was there. And I was saying this weird mantra that just was coming out of my mouth. I was saying, it's not supposed to be me. This is a service I provide to strangers. It's not supposed to be me. I'm the idealist. I'm not the mourner. And in that sense, it's been a horrible year that I've thought about death so much and thinking about my own death and talking to my kids more about my own death, and they don't want to hear it. And when I used to debate Christopher Hitchens, and who passed away way too soon, and he was a great man in his way, world's most famous atheist, and Richard Dawkins, who I debated many times, I began to see that the evolutionists, the thing about evolution, no matter how true many scientists believe it to be, and I debated them, it's such a cynical view of life that as soon as you're born, your cells begin to die, and you begin to die. And that the law of entropy increase, that energy dissipates and everything goes from order to chaos. And it's a very, very cynical view of life. And when I went to the Galapagos for the first time, Debbie took me there for my 40th birthday, I understood how Darwin got the theory. Because in the Galapagos, you literally see everything eating each other and dead eggs everywhere and dead fried lizards that have been baked by the sun. And you see death surrounding you. And I said to myself, you know what? Darwin lost his faith here in the Galapagos, became the father of evolution, but he wanted to be a Church of England pastor before then. Maybe it's good sometimes not to be so rational. Maybe we're not supposed to look.
I don't know why you think I'm so rational.
I think that's. I think that's the genius of your columns, that they're so analytical. That's why people like them.
That's what I do for a living.
Darwin was not saying, he actually wasn't talking about the slow death of your cells and ultimate death of you. He was actually speaking to much more seismic events. Evolution was not about finches modifying themselves a little bit. It was 3 years when there's no water on this island, and every finch with a soft beak dies, and the 3 finches with hard beaks that can peck their way through the nut live, and they become the only finches on the island. It's actually a cautionary tale for humanity. We don't slowly evolve to be different. You have whole-scale genocide, slaughter, destruction, chaos, when a minority of people become the majority of people. I mean, there are great examples through history. I mean, I'll just pick the bubonic plague, the Dark Death, Black Death. You know, if you had an ailment called hemochromatosis, which is much more common now than it was in human history, you actually, the bug, the Yersinia pestis, couldn't get into your cells and survive. So you didn't die during the illness that killed at least 25% of all people in Europe. Which means there are much more of you around now with this weird genetic defect that sometimes presents problems when you get older. But that's the kind of shift he was talking about. I think ignoring that reality means that you're willing to risk everything. That stated, I've got to go rest up for having a big operation tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
So I'm going to.
Thank you for everything you're doing for Bret's mother.
I'm not doing anything, I'm watching, but I'm just.
And I want to thank my son Mendy for organizing everything tonight. Thank you, Mendy.